this graduate seminar series. And I am Pranjali. I'm a PhD student at the Cognitive Science Department, and I'll be the discussant today. Our speaker today is Vaishak. He is a doctoral student in Humanities and Social Sciences. And today he'll be presenting on his doctoral research topic, that is ecology and language ideology, making sense of tsunami in the Nicobar Islands. So I'll just go with the format of the talk first. So I'll just briefly introduce Vaishak, a couple of minutes about his work, and then he'll begin with his talk for 25 to 30 minutes around. Then we'll have a discussion session, like a couple of questions from me, and then we'll keep it open for everybody. Okay. So basically, Vaishak's research is on endangerment of Lura language from Teresa Island in Nicobar, and he's doing this endangerment research post tsunami and how this process of endangerment happened after the resettlement of the speakers of Lura language, and there are definitely multiple factors which might have affected it, socioeconomic settings, and how government kind of rearrange the entire systems, and multiple things that he'll be looking into. And he's primarily focusing on you know how Lura and the language which is spoken by the neighboring island Sanenya, and how the speakers of Lura and Sanenya kind of now interact, and how they are perceiving this endangerment, and the current state of how this language is and what it could be. So he plans to investigate this around next year. I think he's going to the fieldwork
Hopefully.
next year. He has already worked in Nicobar Islands, so he kind of has some rapport already with the localites, and he has an edge over understanding how this process would be, and he also knows the languages. So it would be a very, very interesting research, and we'll get a glimpse of it in his talk today, I guess. So Vaishak, without any further ado, let's start. Over to you.
Yeah, okay. Thanks, Pranjali, for that generous introduction and that summary as well. Is my screen visible? Let me know when it's visible. It's visible now, right?
It is visible.
Okay, any gray areas or anything?
Yes,
Nothing,
yes.
right? Okay. All right. Okay. All right. So thank you all for coming. 35 people. That's a big turnout. I didn't expect that much, but yeah, thank you all. That glad you could join us today. So today I'll be talking about my own PhD research thesis, the kind of work I've done so far, and what I'm planning to do in the future. Is someone unmuted? Pranjali, if you could just mute that person. But yeah, so the title of my PhD research is, as you can see here, Ecology and Language Ideology, Making Sense of the Tsunami in the Nicobar Islands. So here, the idea of making sense works in two ways. Number one, of the people who are living in Nicobar, how are they making sense of tsunami and its after effects? And number two, me as a researcher, how am I, as an outsider, making sense of these changes that are found in these islands? So moving on to the introduction. So as I said, my research aims to explore the relationship between ecological disruption, which in this case is tsunami, which is like a sudden disruption, and language ideology. Now, we'll come to what is language ideology in the coming slides. And I'll be doing this by looking specifically at one island and the situation there. It's called Teresa Island. It is situated in the Bay of Bengal Ocean, it's part of the Nicobar group. So I would just like to show you a little bit of the geography of the place. I don't know, is this visible? Pranjali, can you? I'm assuming it is visible and going.
Yeah, we are just seeing the shifting.
Okay.
Yeah, it's there.
All right. Okay. So this is the island, Teresa Island, that we are talking about. And this is in central Nicobar. This is Chaura Island. The language spoken in this island has a big role to play in this island as well. And just to get a scale of, things, we can zoom out a little bit. And we see that over here, I think I'm zooming in, sorry. Right. So as I zoom out, this area is the Central Nicobar Island. As you can see over here, this area. And as we move further, uh, yeah, we have the South Nicobar Islands over here. Oh, sorry, too far. We have the South Nicobar Islands over here and the northern Car Nicobar Island over here. So Teresa has at least the entirety of Nicobar has at least 6 languages. Now I say at least 6 because that is the official figure, but my investigation kind of showed that there may be more. And Teresa Island in particular has at least 4 languages. Well, the one is Lura, the native language of the island. The other most prominent language is Sanenia, which is the language of this small island over here. And there is also Poo, which is the language of Car Nicobar up in the north. Plus, it also has some people speaking Muat, which is the language of these island groups over here. And that has come there through intermarriage. So going back to the presentation. So as I was saying, there are at least 4 languages, and these languages have been classified into the Austro-Asiatic language family, which consists of languages in, let's say, the Vietnamese area, Southeast Asian areas mostly. So Thai, Vietnamese, all of these are part of Austro-Asiatic languages. Now, the context in which my research takes place is that of tsunami. So as most of you might be aware, the tsunami of 2004 in December, it was a catastrophic event of an unprecedented scale, and it caused widespread changes in the geography, ecology, demography, and even socio-political relations. So there was a huge loss of land and people, and as you can see in Teresa, all the villages were washed away completely. In Chaura, the nearby island, the damage was so catastrophic that the government decided to resettle them into Teresa. But interestingly, after a couple of years, most of them went back to Chaura saying that they want to die in the place where they were born. And after this, even the living conditions, material conditions of the people changed, because earlier they used to stay in their traditional sort of homes, which had like a common house in the middle, surrounded by smaller huts. Whereas now all of them live in structures made of concrete and asbestos sheet and some wood, which is built for them by another company, which came from the outside. So yeah, that sort of a change happened. As well as what happened was the land redistribution and monetary compensation. Now, research has shown that these measures, which were taken in the post-tsunami time period, were not exactly taking into consideration their local arrangements, how they were used to having these sort of social relations of land owning or having money or class systems. And this led to some unforeseen reconfigurations. So one of these reconfigurations or one of these changes that I sort of observed in the island was the discourse of endangerment. So the first time I had an encounter with Teresa Island was in 2018 when I was doing a language documentation project in which I was supposed to make a dictionary and grammar sketch of the language. So I did my fieldwork there for a period of 3 months over a period of 1.5 years, like 1 month each. So during my fieldwork, most of the consultants told me that these days nobody's speaking Lura and everybody is speaking Sanenia, the language of the neighboring island. And they told me that people only talk in Lura when they want to talk to old people who only understand Lura and not Sanenia. And the use of use of Sanenia in Teresa Island became so prominent that even the tribal council meetings, which is like the sort of a panchayat meeting, can be like a good comparison. Even that is now held in Sanenia and not in Lura, which is supposed to be the native or original language of the community. And there are multiple claims, right? The settlers, who are people who came from Chaura Island and settled in Teresa Island, they claim that we don't even understand this language. They say these words, but we don't understand what they're talking about. On the other hand, the Lura speakers or the people who belong to Teresa, they say that, this language is very difficult to learn. That's why nobody is speaking these days. But, in the past, everybody used to speak Lura. Now, this is the discourse that I got during my field work. But along with this, I also got some counter discourses, some things that went against this idea of language endangerment. So, for example, one of my consultants, Mr. Edward, he settled in Teresa from Chau. He came from Chaura, settled in Teresa in 1977, which is like 40, 60 years ago almost. And he learned the language. He learned Lura. Say, and he was of the opinion that it's not that difficult. You just need to take some time to learn it. And similarly, contrary to a past where everybody spoke Lura, there was Kuchuch who belongs to Teresa supposedly. She was around 40, 45 years old, but she never learned Lura as a child because apparently her grandfather used to scold her for speaking incorrect Lura. So these sort of counter discourses were there. Along with this, we also did a lexical and sort of structural similarity in which we found that there were a lot of same words. For instance, body part terms, very basic terms like body part. So the back side of your body is called uk in both languages. The belly is called viang in both languages. Blood is called va in both languages. Even the relationships, like father, is called year in both the languages. And even when there were changes, most of the changes were very pattern bound. And when I say pattern bound, it means that the same sound was being replaced in when it goes to another language. For instance, in Lura, for the verb come, the word is yuk, whereas in Sanenya, the y changes to a ra and becomes a ruk. Now, this is also seen in, for example, the word for three, which is yuich in Lura and ruich in Sanenya. Similarly, water is ayak in Lura and rak in Sanenya. So these sort of changes were also observed. And previous research conducted before the 2018 documentation also showed that there was some level of mutual understanding of these languages. So Winston Cruz, who did his fieldwork right before the tsunami, he said that inhabitants of Chaura, the other island itself, they could speak very well in Lura. And E.H. Mann, he was a British, administrator and anthropologist who worked in these island areas in 1889. He also notes that, inhabitants of Teresa spoke Sanenia fairly well. So, and on top of that, there has been a long history of migration and settlement across this entire Nicobar region. There is a lot of intermarriage as well. So, the point is that this level of sustained contact between these two communities between any two communities like this usually involves a sort of linguistic negotiation in which either a common language or lingua franca is born, or there is a stable multilingualism where one language is used in particular domains like market, government jobs, or whatever, whereas the other language is used in its own domains like home domain, talking to children, or something like that. So it is at this point that I'm placing my research question. This is where my sort of observation comes in. So the emergence of language loss discourse in Teresa seems to coincide with the 2004 tsunami, since we saw that before that there seemed to be sort of mutual intelligibility. So is this an ideological response used to rationalize and negotiate with the post-tsunami social cultural milieu? This is my, in a way, overarching or broad question that I'm asking, in which I'm basically asking, is there a relationship between language loss and climate change? And bear in mind, I am not positing a cause-effect relationship, but I'm more interested in sort of the interrelationship, so to speak. How are they connected? How are they influencing each other? So to answer these questions, there are sub-questions which will be going more deeper into these issues. So first one, what is the social, linguistic, and metalinguistic construction of Lura and Sanenya as language labels and linguistic identities? So in this particular question, I'm trying to problematize the very idea of a language, what we call as, let's say, Hindi or Urdu, or, all these things. So the thing is, the idea of a language is not just about the grammar or the dictionary or the words, right? A language has a social construction. It has a linguistic construction, of course, which is the syntax or grammar or whatever. And it also has a metalinguistic construction. By metalinguistic, I mean language about language. So an accessible example would be the case of Hindi Urdu. Now, what we call modern Hindi and modern Urdu are technically speaking or linguistically speaking, the same language. They have the same grammatical structure. They have a lot of such grammatical similarities. What happened was there was a older, what we call older Hindi or old Hindi, which after the arrival of Urdu or the after the evolution of Urdu became known as Hindustani. If you look at the British records, all of them speak about how Indians speak Hindustani, which was like a mix of both Hindi and Urdu. And post independence, these two languages became got like a social construction, right? So Hindi started adapting more and more Sanskrit words and used the Devanagari writing system. That's a social construction. Whereas Urdu, on the other hand, went the other way. It adapted Arabic words and adapted the Nastaliq or Persian writing system. And then these were given a metalinguistic construction where Hindi was, posited or like held up as the language of India, whereas Urdu became the language of Pakistan. So the point being that languages also have social, weight to them. So that's what I'll be. I'll be looking at how Lura and Sanenia function in a similar manner in Teresa, and how do they function as indexical markers of social position. Now, what do I mean by indexical marker? An indexical marker is when certain language varieties and structures have a social attribute, as I mentioned earlier, right? So if you're speaking Urdu, you may be considered, it's a very big stereotype, but you may be considered to be a Pakistani, right? So that is what is called indexing. So using a particular language or even a particular linguistic structure, for example, it's very stereotypical of, let's say, Malayalis to use the retroflex sounds. So when I talk to my friends, they say, "Oh, Malayalam is just anda panda panda." They say that because the retroflex sound is the most prominent sort of feature of Malayalam, and using that sound tells people that you are a Malayali. And this is the idea of indexicality. So I'll be looking at what positions or what sort of social positions do these languages index or the use of these languages index, right? And finally, I look at how these language labels interact with processes such as migration, land ownership, and family structure, to name a few. So here, the idea is that language is not simply a means of communication. It's not something that you just use to talk or give information. It is something that we use to make sense of the world around us. And it has a very active role rather than just as a passive medium of communication. So that is what this question will be focusing on. That how language and language labels and ideas about language interact with these processes that are a consequence of climate change and climate disruption. Moving on, I'll now look at the theoretical engagement that I'm positing for this question. So language endangerment has been studied in linguistics for a long time, especially in the 90s. There has been a huge rush of efforts to save language because linguists realized that a lot of languages are being extinct, and there was a rush to document languages. So in the early 90s, the approach towards language endangerment was mostly that of a ecological perspective. So we talk about language as if they were organisms, as if they are part of nature, right? We talk about in terms of preserving languages or how languages are endangered or threatened or even extinct for that matter, right? And the solution for this was to document the language, just to have a copy, you have a sort of record of the language before it is completely gone from the earth. Now, this perspective was criticized in the early 2000s for its essentialization of language, nature, and indigenous people. Basically, it equated one language, the case, multilingualism is a norm, and also kind of put a pressure on on those communities to be the custodians of language, and by extension, custodians of the nature that they live in. And we do see this even now, where tribal communities are sort of exoticized as pristine people living in exotic places, very well in touch with nature. And this sort of representation is not that's also not a true or objective representation. So basically, the objectivity or the neutrality of documentation was questioned, and the very fact that there was too much of focus on documentation, right? So in some cases, documentation is not what you need. You need some social interventions. That's what you need to like bring back a language. So these questions came up. But however, the concept of ecology, it still retains some relevance in our current scenario, because of the fact that the field of anthropology has been looking into the idea of climate change quite recently. It's a new sort of paradigm shift, I would say, that's happening in anthropology, which is to look at Anthropocene, right, with the age of human beings. So in this research, the idea is to look beyond global level processes and focus on the effects and local understandings of climate change. So this goes back to the idea of making sense, right? How do local communities make sense of climate change? And it focuses on something called resource materialism. Basically, how are resources or materials in our surroundings related to our daily lives, and how are they distributed, and how they end up having human meaning, not just a non-living thing, but something with a meaning. For instance, land is the big thing in that, right? So belongingness comes from belonging to a land, belonging to a nation. Even that comes from land. Similarly, monuments, we all consider our religious monuments to be sacred. There's some meaning to it rather than just a building. So how do indigenous communities, how do these relations change during a climate change is the focus of this sort of theoretical exploration. So basically, the divide between nature and human and the social and ecological becomes very blurred. So you can't separate between a social issue and an ecological issue, um, and because there is a lot of interconnection. And this explores practices in response to climate change, such as migration, exchange, innovation, all of these things. But the thing is that even in case of natural disasters, where it's not like climate change, which happens over a long time, but a natural disaster happens in an instant, and it's a very real and present danger for the community. Even then, the focus has been on ethnography of local systems of adaptation, like migration, innovation, and all that, and the historical antecedents. What's missing in this sort of investigation is the role of language. And here, I'm kind of the idea is that language as a semiotic resource, as a tool, has a crucial role to play in mediating socio-ecological change. And this hasn't been adequately explored in this sort of route. That's my claim. Uh,
Vaishnak, you have 5 more minutes, okay?
okay, I'll take maybe 7 more. That's fine?
Okay, that's fine. That's fine.
Yeah. So, right. So, moving on. So, this is where I'm putting my research. I'm saying that there hasn't been much of exploration of how language as a semiotic medium and as a semiotic tool, which both undergoes change, as we saw in case of language loss, as well as kind of has a role to play in how these social relations are constructed after a climate change happens, or after an ecological disruption happens. So this research will contribute by expanding the scope of anthropology of climate change and exploring how language functions both as a resource that undergoes change, as well as a tool that is used to mediate this change that is happening. So it has a double role to play in there. So moving on quickly to what is language ideology, which is my basic lens. So language ideology, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, is the belief, it's beliefs and convictions about language, language use, and language users. So, basically the stories that we tell ourselves, saying that Urdu is a sweet language, or, I don't know, Hindi is a rough language. All of these are language ideologies. Basically, your perceptions about language. So this language ideology asks, how is language represented? What are the stories about language? What material circumstances are these representations support? As in, what's the class structures, or what are the religious structures that are there in support of, or are being supported by particular language ideology? And what kind of people have these ideologies? So in other words, it talks about the relationship between socio-political and economic aspirations of a community, what they want to be, and the dynamic social and material context these are embedded in. So when I say dynamic social context, in case of climate change, will be something like migration, land loss, kingship practices, etc. So how does language and language ideology, thoughts about language, interact with all of these things? So as I said, language is a crucial role in making sense of these contexts. As an example, we have how Mexican migrants and non-migrants create their imagined life or their belongingness based on this idea of migration discourse. So the talk about migration, their speech about the way they talk about migration is a central part of how they construct their own social identities. So similarly, I will be looking at the linguistic situation in Teresa to understand how these language ideologies are in a way used to make sense of the post-tsunami changes that happened in the island. So I'll be taking language endangerment as a quintessential anthropological fact. It is embedded in the ways in which speakers understand the distribution of languages in relation to the social and material world that's out there. And why is this? Because language ideology sort of provides the perfect medium to look at this complicated multilingual situation. It is inherently plural. There is never a single ideology. There's always ideologies. So as we saw earlier, the ideology, the claim that Lura is tough is an ideology. Whereas also the claim that Lura is not tough, you just have to like learn it a little bit. That's another ideology. So these ideologies coexist and they kind of influence each other and change each other. So it's inherently plural, and there is a dialectic relation. They're also inherently incomplete, and they are like systems of value. So they're always contested. There's always a effort to change ideologies, and this tension is what kind of creates the social world that we see outside. So this, as I said, is an ideal for exploring multilingual situations, and it also gives me a scope to explore how these language labels themselves are constructed. And this is why I'm using ideology as a lens. And the final slide here, close to the end, it's about methodology, how I'll carry out this task. So this is still in the very early developmental stages. So I'm planning on a 14-month field trip with 3 months in Port Blair, which is the capital of Andaman Nicobar Island Group, and 11 months in Teresa. Port Blair, I'll be doing archival research where I'll be looking at the official figures of deaths and land distribution and things like that, as well as interviews of people who are people from Teresa and Chaura who are living in Port Blair. Similarly, once I reach Teresa, I'll be doing long, semi-structured interviews, as well as in-depth parts of observation. And I'm not going in there with an intention of finding evidence, whereas more than that, I'll be looking to interpret what's happening, the communicative practices. So that is basically my research project and where it's reached now. These are some of the references that I've used in the presentation. Yeah, that's basically it. Thank you all for listening. Thank you all for the time. Pranjali, over to you.
Thank you, Vaishak. It was very interesting. I'm sure everybody liked it and they have a lot of questions. I'll begin with, I have total of 3 to 4 questions.
Okay.
Would you like to take them one by one, or should I give them all of them together?
I guess I'll go one by one,
Okay.
depending on the questions. Yeah.
So starting with a methodological question, I would like to ask, how are you planning to test their metalinguistic awareness? Okay. I understand the social changes, you will have documentation, given the land redistribution, and because the entire city was kind of like, the entire place was kind of rebuilt, so it will be easier to trace that kind of change, socio-economic change, right? Even linguistic distinctions, because you might have records from previous research and things like that. But in case of metalinguistic awareness, you'll have to rely on the narratives, one, and two, also there might be multiple factors that are affecting this metalinguistic awareness, right? So how are you, one, going to test it, and how do you think it will be potentially related to the post-tsunami situation? Why do you think it will be related? So I would rather focus on the first end of the question, like how exactly are you going to test it and how will you validate that?
Right. So as I already mentioned, this won't be like I'm not testing for anything, to be honest. The idea is to go there and observe these metalinguistic narratives. So as I mentioned, the narrative that Lura is tough. That's a metalinguistic narrative. You're talking about the language. So these can be of two types. So it can be overt metalinguistic narratives and covert. So this overt ideology and covert ideology. So overt ideology, I will be understanding that in the initial phase of my fieldwork through interviews, where I'll be asking them questions about, what do they think of the language and things like that. And then I will be trying to understand the covert ideologies and these metalinguistic narratives during my Partisan observation, where and I'm hoping by the time I will have developed my language skills as well. So I will be able to actually look at their communicative practice and see if the covert overt language ideologies or narratives still hold place. So
Okay.
yeah,
So,
go
so
on.
just regarding the covert part of it, that is where I have a tiny question. Uh, because Lura is endangered and like hardly it's spoken there now, do you
Hmm.
think in their daily activities or without you intruding in it, you will find significant usage of Lura or talk about Lura? Because we also have a lot of endangered languages and we don't usually speak about them on a daily basis in our any kind of interactions unless somebody asks about it, right? So
Right,
unless you
right.
kind of know or you are guiding them to answer something about the language,
Hmm.
so your metalinguistic narrative will be sort of guided rather than being a natural process, right?
Right. So the overt narratives, obviously, because I'm taking an interview, but in the covert one, there won't be any guidance from me per se. The idea is to like be a fly in the wall and observe. And when I say covert narratives, it may not always be just about like let's say language use. It's about even in the conversations that they have, the very difference between Lura and Sanenya is kind of blurry. You see what I'm saying? So,
Yes.
then based on the patterns of how they use these languages and with whom they use these sort of varieties, I'll get more insights. And I'm pretty sure that it won't just be two languages. It will be a mix of. It'll be like that's the thing. So these languages have been sort of classified as a dialect continuum or a dialect chain by previous research, which happened in the like let's say early 20th century, I would say. But they themselves consider these to be separate separate languages and separate identities. So how are they performing these identities? That will be how I'll be understanding the covert linguistic narratives.
Okay.
Yeah.
Um, so just a follow-up tiny question. So like you said, the islands were kind of stable multilingual pre-tsunami in the pre-tsunami time. And was there any form of hierarchy amongst these two languages which was existing? Because
Yeah.
that will definitely affect the post-tsunami kind of dynamic if Lura is getting, going away or things like that. Yeah.
Right, right, yeah, yeah. Thanks. Yeah, that's a good question. So, the pre-tsunami stable multilingualism, it's not 100%. I'm not 100% sure about that. There may have still been some sort of language-based tensions, but the available information that we have, which is very less, to be honest, it's like has been hardly any research on these island groups. That shows that there may have been a stable multilingualism. So about the hierarchy part, yes. So in Teresa Island, the land is owned by supposedly Lura-speaking community, and people have migrated from Chaura and settled there as to begin with. They settle as endangered as laborers, and once they have finished a particular amount of time or if they've done good work, the landowners who are from Teresa will sort of give them a portion of their land. Right.
Right.
So in that sense, we would expect the hierarchy to be in a way that the Teresa people have a hold over the functioning because land, and also because they are more authentic or native people of the island. Right. So we will expect for them to
Sure.
have.
So this was post-tsunami. I was more curious about the pre-tsunami time. Were there any hierarchies existing then?
Yeah, in the this is pre-tsunami also the same thing used to happen. So the
Okay.
migration settlement. So it was so much so that by I think 1965, there was a village in Teresa which is full of only people from Chaura. It was called Alurong, and
And all of them were Sinenya speakers.
yeah, and even the very idea of a Teresa person or a Chaura person is becoming complicated now because there is a big prevalence of inter-island marriage. So I've met a lot
Right.
of people who's from Teresa, but they've married someone from Chaura, or their parents are like, one is from Teresa, one is from Chaura. So how do they construct their own identity? That's also part of my question.
Okay.
So yeah.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, just a very related question to that thing. Like there was heavy migration and inter-island travels, and also like you said, the languages are so close as if they are like dialects of the same. Like it
Right.
feels like as if they are dialects of the same language. So, why do you think post-tsunami, apart from the social reconstruction,
Hmm.
uh, because social reconstruction can also happen in itself, why do you think language will mediate this? What I'm going to ask. Uh, so, why will there be two different stark groups engaging with these language labels and have them as markers of their social positions? Because, like you said yourself, they will be, it's a very complex kind of a system because a lot of people from Chaura had already come to Teresa. They already have their identities. Some of them have even, become the landowners, and
Hmm.
so the social positions are there in a way, and also government might have done some kind of justice in kind of distribution of the lands, right? So in a way there has been a new creolization that is happening. Okay. So there is always indirect indexicality in terms of a stable multilingual state. Okay, when there is a stable multilingual state, which was kind of like you said existing in pre-tsunami's time, but
Right.
now you're saying it will become a direct indexical state of having this language and this community, and their social positions will be related to it, so it's kind of a strong correlation. So
Right. Right.
uh, why do you think this will suddenly happen? I mean,
Right.
it might still stay blurry.
Yeah, I get your question. So yeah, so the idea is that when I said stable multilingualism, I didn't mean that in the absolute sense. So and there is never something called like absolutely stable multilingualism, right? That's the idea of language ideology, that there is always contestation, even though we have reached some community has reached a stage of stable multilingualism. There can always be changes. So the idea here is that it is possible that even in the pre-tsunami time period, there have been socio-cultural tensions, right? And between, and there has been some inter-ethnic tensions as well. And the identity of Chaura people, for instance, they are very sort of how do I say it? They're very strong about their identity. Like, so there is a rule, for instance, that if someone outside of Chaura marries
Right.
into a family, they have to learn the language. That's a very
Right.
important ritual, or like a part of the marriage agreement. The same thing can't be found in Teresa families. So so there are these differences also. So what I'm saying is, there may have been pre-existing tensions in the pre-tsunami time period, and tsunami might have acted as a catalyst. It may not have been a cause per se, but it may have pushed the communities to like go this way, or like, how they say, right, the last feather that broke the camel's back. I'm thinking of tsunami in that sense. It's not like a cause per se. So I don't know. Does that answer the
Okay.
question? Or
Sort of. I was looking into more. Why do you think these will become like stark markers of social positions?
oh,
Because
I'm not saying
initially,
it will become. I'm saying that I kind of observe them heading in that direction.
okay,
So, for example,
all right,
I'll give you another sort of anecdote for that. So, this was the third field trip. Not I was not there. Like my colleague who was documenting Sanenya was doing his field work, and he asked one of his consultants that. So we looked at these languages, and to us they look the same. The words are the same,
yeah,
sentences are the same. And then this person says, "Yeah, language. That's the same language, but we don't speak that language." So, see, that kind of shows that there is a clear sort of ideological position that they're taking against, this idea that these are same languages, you're all the same people. There is some way they are positing a difference. And my question is, what is the difference and why is that difference? So, I
okay,
guess, yeah, that's the idea.
okay, okay.
Yeah.
And I'll end with this question. So, why and how do you think language acts as a resource? I know you still have to kind of investigate this, but given that it is one of your major questions, research questions, I wanted to know why and how do you think language acts as a resource that mediates, resource usage in post-disaster situation? because resource uses, I would say, is more dependent on practical issues. Okay,
Right.
language mediation will be a very, very, very tiny element from it, probably, because there's another, like, government, you know, is kind of imposing, playing a role in this and kind of determining the socioeconomic state of the resettlement. Okay, so how it might, transform or something, there might be some impact of language in it, but why do you think in the basic resource allocation itself, or this resource management that you're saying, why do you think language is playing a role there?
Right. So resource management, as you mentioned, is like a practical affair, but there's also a question of who gets to decide resource management part, and that is decided based on a social position, right? So, for
Is it?
example,
I mean, I'm sorry. I mean, isn't
yeah,
it?
because okay, so I'll tell you how it happened in Nicobar. So
Right.
when this post tsunami thing happened, the government came in and then they gave the authority for dividing the resources to the heads of the panchayat or something like that. I had to go back to the reading for that, but basically they had a different sort of system in place where the idea of authenticity, idea of who has the authority in the community to decide which land goes to where, that was overlooked. You see, so this is where the resource division, not just in a post disaster phase, even in general, even in a non-disaster situation, the division of resources depends very much on your class position, your gender, your caste, all these social positions, right? And
Yes.
these positions are in a way, we can see how they can be constructed and negotiated by the use of language. I mean, I may have to cite some examples for that.
Yeah. I mean, it a little feels like, because you're particularly looking in a post-disaster situation, and then you're
Right.
saying that it's going to claim. So I just want to know how strong this relation
Right.
is.
So one example would be from the research by Jane Hill. So she worked in Mexicano region, the Malinche region of Mexico, where she looked at people who, indigenous communities who speak this language called Mexicano or Nahuatl, along with Spanish, right? And she
Yeah.
saw that there was a sort of discourse of nostalgia about this language, saying that, oh, in the previous ages, it has been a great, it was a great age of equality, justice, and all that. But she found that this was espoused, or this sort of metalinguistic narrative, so to speak, was
Yeah.
given out mostly by men who had property. When she looked at women who and men who didn't have property, they were of the opinion that even in the in the earlier times, there was a lot of injustice, and even the language was not that pure and all that, right? So in here, the what the propertied men are trying to do is to consolidate power, and by extension, control of resources. And the on the other hand, the women and the non-property men who are creating this counter discourse, their idea is to as the name suggests, to counter this discourse of nostalgia and fight for a little more egalitarian society, maybe. So this is how
Okay.
language can play a role in resource management as well, because the very idea of resource ownership is coming from social positions, and language has
Yeah,
a
but
huge
again, there I would say it was always the social positions which determined, you know, uh, I'm still not able to see how strongly language would play a role in this. Rather, because it's
right.
just the
So
directly the social
that
positions
I might
itself which
have
is
to
impacting, the resource allocation, or even the kind of
exactly,
how it's
but
going to
the
happen in future, or what it was in the past.
yeah. So, but my research will look at what's the role of language in creating these social positions, and there is. I mean, I don't have the research right now, but there has
Right.
been work which looked at this, how language creates these social positions. So that's the
Sure. I
angle.
think we can always go on about this, but let's just open it to everybody
Yeah,
now.
yeah, yeah.
Uh,
Okay.
yeah, yeah, consumed my time. Any questions? You can either post it in the chat. I can read it for Vaishak, or he can read it himself, and uh, or you can just unmute and talk. Any questions, curiosities, please?
Okay. Hi. Am I audible?
Yes, hi
Yes.
Vishaka.
Yes.
Hi, Vaishak. This was a great talk. Thank you for organizing this. And okay, so my question was about your fieldwork experience. So, very basic question. Okay, like where did this all begin? What were the sort of conversations that led to you focusing on this being a clear issue worth investigating?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Vishaka, for the question. So, as I said, my first interaction with the community happened in 2018, and it was very curious. So, we were a team of 4 people, and we were supposed to document the language of Teresa as well as Chaura, basically Lura and Sanenya. And Chaura, which is a very under-resourced island, it's like a smaller island, of course. There's no elevation; it's all like flat land. There is no drinking water. So and people, so because of that, the research team could not go to Chaura, and we had to like stay in Teresa. And once we reached there, we started looking for people who would give us data about the language. And the every other person who we go and talk to would say, "Oh, Lura, you don't talk Lura. We can tell you about Sanenia, but Lura, we don't. Like you have to ask someone else, or someone else, someone else." And every other person who my team members spoke to, they were willing to give language on Sanenia. So it was very curious to see that the island where Lura is supposed to be spoken, nobody is speaking Lura. And then I went and talked to some older people. One of my most dear closest consultants is Mr. Eric Jethro. He's the captain of the chairman of the tribal council, and he was one of the first people to tell me that these days nobody speaks Lura, everybody just wants to speak Sanenia. And then he was the one who also told me that things like, oh, this is a very tough language, that's why nobody is speaking this language and all that. So I guess that's how I started observing this sort of curious phenomenon. And of course, as I said, as we documented more, we saw that these languages very similar. And it didn't make sense as to why there would be a discourse of language loss. Sure, there may be a discourse of social infiltration or whatever, but by the other island people, but why language? So I think that's what got me into this whole where I am right now, basically. Yeah. So that's basically it.
Thanks a lot.
Yeah. Any other questions? Anyone? Comments, insights, anything will do.
Hi, Vaishak.
Hi,
Can you
Swati.
hear me? Hi. So I had a question about stigma related to Lura, because I
Okay.
felt that maybe from your presentation, at least it seemed to me, that there might be some stigma associated with the language. Maybe the anecdotes that you said, that, the moment you would ask about Lura, instead of Sanenya, people would, divert the discussion to Sanenya rather than talking about Lura. So
Right.
is there any, or was there in the pre-tsunami times, any stigma associated with it, which is why the tsunami acted maybe as a catalyst to, put an end to it? And still how? Because I'm still I'm hazy about how tsunami would act as a catalyst, even if there was a stigma attached. How would it act as a catalyst to end? And why just 2004? As in, have there been natural disasters after 2004? And if so, what role have they played? And what other languages have, been disappeared after that? Has Lura come back? If so, to what extent? So on and so forth. But yeah,
Right.
I'll stop there.
Yeah. Thank you,
Thank you.
Swati. So yeah, the idea of stigma in language endangerment research is a very prominent sort of thing. We usually associate with the idea of prestige. Speakers of the language themselves feel stigmatized to speak that language. It's happened in a lot of cases, not just in India, even in the US, where the Native American people were forced, they put into boarding schools and they were beaten up if they spoke in their language. So yes, there is an idea of stigma associated with the idea of language loss. But in this particular case, I have a feeling, again, this is like initial stages of my research, right? But I have a feeling it's the other way around. Lura here is sort of being projected as a heritage language or a classical language. This is like I'm borrowing terms from different literature, but these sort of by kind of making it exclusive to a certain group of people. They're trying to posit this idea that, Lura is the authentic language of Teresa, and therefore the people of Teresa should have more, role to play, or more control over the island and its functions. Again, I'm oversimplifying it, obviously, but this is the basic idea, right? And that is why I feel that there is a discourse that is expounded by the people of Teresa itself, that there is a language loss per se. And talking about other disasters, yes, there may have been other disasters, but my study is specifically based on, Teresa, and the disaster that happened in Teresa, which is tsunami, which happened in 2004. And post that, there haven't been any disaster of that scale. Sure, there may have been like hurricanes and all that, but this tsunami was, it was unprecedented. So they didn't have like houses to live for 3 years until an external company came and built their houses. So basically, the tsunami tore apart their social fabric, and they reconstructed that somehow, and it had some hand of the government in it. They had their own systems that were, in place. So, for example, there's research that shows that, kin-based systems were less effective than cooperative systems in case of Chaura, because in Chaura there is a corporate-based system of exchange, and in other parts of Nicobar it's a kin-based system of exchange. It was shown that the Chaura system was better. So all these elements come into play, So that's why I'm looking at the role of language here, and language has a role to play in these mediations, as I was telling Pranjali also. The idea that with language you can construct a nation. We have the idea of a nation itself can be linguistic. We have Hindi as a national language, quote unquote, of India, or I was mentioning that already. So yeah, this is why I'm positing language as a possible uh, space, or element where I can look for these the cause for these changes, these socioeconomic changes that happen. So yeah. And of course, this is like an initial stage, so I'm still not clear on many things, which I hope will be clear in the coming 2 or 3 years once I have more field experience and stuff. But yeah. Any other questions? Okay, if not, then I
More
guess.
questions, comments? We can wrap it up.
Yeah, it's already 6 o'clock.
All right. Okay. Thank you everybody for attending. It was a very interesting talk, Vaishak.
Yeah, thanks, Panjali. Thanks for moderating. Yeah, thank you all for coming. Yeah, thanks, Rashid. So yeah, the next talk in this series is scheduled in the third week of December, between 21st and 24th. We'll be sharing the details of the talk as in nearer to the time. So yeah, thank you all for coming. Thank you for turning up. Yeah, bye. Yeah, thanks, Gyana. Learn to spell my name.